This is Duke University.
It gives me great pleasure now to introduce Bill Chafe. When I went around Duke and UNC and talking to people about this conference, one of the first things that everybody kept asking was, have you talked to Bill yet? You got to have Bill. Can't do this without Bill. So it gave me great pleasure to meet with someone whose research, writings, and friendship going back to the history of the civil rights movement in the South, including right here where we are. One of the points that I oftentimes end up telling my own students is if you are situated in Durham or Chapel Hill, you are between two of the epicenters of the civil rights movement, between the lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro and the start of SNCC, Ella Baker, Shaw University in Raleigh, right? 20 minutes this way, 40 minutes that way. There's a monumental burden and privilege of history that rests right here in this area. Let me encourage you to please join me in welcoming Bill Chafe.
Thank you so much, Omid and Mark and Julianne, for making this conference possible. I want to begin by saying that I am the least knowledgeable person in this room about Malcom X, but I have learned an enormous amount today. I thought that the luncheon conversation and the first session were just amazing in terms of what they taught me. I tried to learn as much as I could, but I want to begin by saying that I'm in awe of the people who are here who know so much more, and I'm going to talk not so much about what I know, but about my experience in taking on another huge, flawed narrative, and then to see whether or not what we did in taking on that flawed narrative might or might not have some relevance to the question of where we go with our effort to understand better Malcom X in the future as well as in the past. So I came to Duke at a time when, and unfortunately it's still true today for most places, with as a master narrative of the civil rights movement. It started in '54 with the Brown decision, moved forward in '55 when Martin Luther King Jr. started the Montgomery bus boycott, also wrong, and concluded when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, a 14-year period. Great story, perfect master narrative, highlighted by Ronald Reagan's description of Martin Luther King Jr. as a person who cared more about the content of your character than the color of your skin, ignoring the fact that he called the United States the greatest militant purveyor of violence in the world, ignoring the fact that he called for socialism, ignoring the fact that he called for a massive redistribution of income, ignoring the fact that he was in fact someone very, very different from that portrayed by Ronald Reagan or countless others. We were fortunate enough when we came to Duke, a couple of us who were literally 6 months out of graduate school. This is really hard to believe. It would not happen today, unfortunately. Came to Duke 6 months out of graduate school. Both myself and my colleague Larry Goodwin and Ray Gavins, we were all concerned about how we could use oral history as a way of complicating the narrative of the civil rights struggle. And particularly how we could look at the way in which the civil rights movement was not part of the 1954 to 1968 period, but actually had profound roots deep in our history. And with the support of some interesting people in the university, we were able, in the first year, to raise $250,000 to create an oral history program, and then 3 years later, almost $3 million from NEH to carry it on. And we brought a whole slew of graduate students to Duke University, most of them African American, who were part of an enterprise to do community studies. You know, oral history used to be just an interview with the rich and the famous and the powerful. We were trying to use oral history to do community studies of the grassroots origins of the civil rights struggle. Where did it come from? How could you find that out? Well, first of all, I had to talk to the people who were doing it. Many of them did not leave papers behind them in archives, and so you had to use oral histories, and they came out of a deep tradition of activism in the community. Now, out of that whole thing, we now know that, Rosa Parks didn't just one day in 1955 decide not to give up her seat. But Rosa Parks had been active in the civil rights struggle for 14 years. She'd been a secretary of the NAACP. She had organized the people in Alabama to protest against the rape of a black woman by 6 white policemen. She was, in effect, one organizer of that movement. The other organizer was Joanne Robinson, a woman in Montgomery, Alabama, who was head of the Women's Political Council, which is kind of a version of the League of Women Voters for black women. And when she was called, not accidentally, by Rosa Parks the day she was arrested, suddenly 40,000 mimeograph sheets appeared the next day to go to the black community. And E.D. Nixon, who was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union, had his people all mobilized the next day, so that by the time Dr. King got involved the next night to speak to the church that was full of people, you had a movement organized. And that movement did not start by accident. It started because a lot of people have been doing it for a long time. Well, those kinds of stories, we didn't know then. We did not know those stories then. And so what we were able to do was to basically recruit people to write the community stories, the studies of how the movement came into being. My own book on the Greensboro sit-ins does not start in 1960. It starts in 1930. And most of the stuff that we've written starts back then. It starts with the National Negro Congress, which was not a top-down body. It starts with people in local communities. It had Southern Tenant Farmers Union. It starts with other people who are basically working together to try to put together a movement that will, in effect, continue the protest, carry it forward, find new ways of moving forward, etc. Out of that, we actually, our graduate students have written more than 15 books. Half of them have won national prizes. We have changed around the historiography of the civil rights movement and challenged that master narrative. We also have been able, through, again, great good luck, but also the support of some important foundations, to create a project called Behind the Veil, in which we've done 1,350 interviews with African Americans in 22 different communities in 11 different states who were alive during the period from 1915 to the present, or especially through the 1960s. Those stories give us a very, very different perspective on the history of the civil rights movement. It's not one of total white oppression and total black obedience or submission. It's one of constant resistance. It's one of building networks of people to go out and challenge the status quo as far as they could go. As far as they could go, and sometimes they went pretty far. Robert Williams in Monroe, North Carolina. When a veteran coming out of World War II is sentenced to death for shooting a white employer, and they had a funeral planned in his hometown with flags draping the casket because he was a veteran, and the Klan said, we're never going to let you have that funeral. We're never going to let you have that funeral. And we're going to prevent it by violence, until Robert Williams organized 20 different black veterans who lined the streets with guns pointed at the Klan cars, which suddenly reversed and went away. Those are the kinds of stories that we need to know more of. Those are the kind of stories that you get by looking at local communities, by looking at where the movement emerges. Now, obviously, there are countless stories like that about the generations who were challenged and mobilized and galvanized by Malcom X. What I don't know is how much work has been done to make those stories real, to go out and find those people, to say, how did you get mobilized, and what have you done since then? We had one comment today about young Malcolmites today. Let's learn about those young Malcolmites today. Have a lot of conversation about the trajectory of what Malcom X stood for. How do we find out that? How do we help to embellish, learn the infrastructure of the kinds of movements that basically came out of that extraordinary life? So I look forward to learning more about Malcom X. I've already learned a huge amount today, but I also hope that we can find ways of proceeding to find other ways of learning more and essentially creating an even more complicated picture than we already have. Thank you.